Welcome to the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University, and welcome to those joining online through our YouTube channel. I am Edward Orlowski, an Associate Professor of Architecture here at Lawrence Tech. I teach design studios that work in areas of community engagement and advocacy through design. I also teach a course in design ethics. At the college, we believe that the future of design is multidisciplinary, and we host a range of design degrees that include graphic design, industrial and transportation design, game design, interiors, and architecture. We track future design trends, emerging technologies, and advancements in practice as a means of crafting education approaches in these areas. Our Design and Technology lecture series allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspectives on where we are headed. Our next lecture will take place on November 22nd at 12:30 when Sandy Attia, co-founding partner of Modus Architects, will speak on crafted constructions. You can sign up for that lecture using the flyers on the table or through our co-ed lecture page. And now I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker for the Fall 2022 Design Technology Lecture Series, Bryan C. Lee Jr. Bryan is an architect, educator, writer, and design justice advocate, or activist, excuse me. He is the founder and design principal of Collocate Design, a nonprofit design practice, the founding organizer of the Design is Protest Collective and Dark Matter University. He has led 2 award-winning architecture and design programs for high school students through the Art Council of New Orleans and the National Organization of Minority Architects, an organization in which he currently serves as South Region Vice President and is President-elect of the national body of NOMA. He's received many awards and fellowships, including being named to the 2018 Fast Company list of the most creative people in business. Collocate is the youngest firm to win the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award in 2019 and was also recognized with the 2021 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in the category of Emerging Designer. Bryan's work provides a platform to initiate dialogue about issues like racism, food justice, and immigration, and explores the role that design professions have played in perpetuating these inequities, as well as new paradigms for a just and inclusive vision of our built environment and society. Today, Bryan will speak on power and place. At the end of the lecture, we'll have time for a 15-minute Q&A session with Bryan. So please, at this time, join me in welcoming Bryan C. Lee, Jr.
Thank you. I've been on the road for a few months now, and this is one of my last trips before I get to go home. I really appreciate you spending time with me today and allowing me to kind of share some of the work that we are putting out into the world, right? None of this work is done by ourselves. It is all done in collaboration, in collective. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what it means to be in collaboration with one another towards justice, towards liberation through the built environment. See, our work is a tool. It's one of the tools that we have in our pocket to be able to serve our communities. And so if we use this tool appropriately, if we use this tool in service of our communities, then we'll have a better pathway forward, not just for ourselves in the profession, but for the profession itself more broadly. I'm going to tell you a few stories, and then we'll get into some of what the work looks like, and then you can ask questions. Yeah? Does that work for everybody? Cool. So we often talk about a few things. One is that a lot of our morals, a lot of our character, a lot of how we are developed as human beings starts at home. And so we talk often about design justice being simply the values that we put into place, that we garner from the world around us, right? So I'm going to tell one story about the history of my family, a generational story. 1960, September of 1960, my great-grandfather purchased a house He purchased this house in Willingboro Township in New Jersey, just outside of Trenton, New Jersey, where my family is from. And he just wanted to kind of move up a little bit to provide a better life for himself and for our family. He bought a house July 30th. Over the course of a month, this house, which sat in a kind of a designated C area, if you think about what redlining looks like, right? Which meant really essentially that the housing stock was not in great shape, but it was a mostly white community for the most part, right? And so they had a little bit of an issue with this postman, this kind of 40-year-old postman who kind of came into their neighborhood. They didn't tell anybody. They just said, okay, well, he's moving in. What are we going to do about it? Over the course of that month, from July 30th to August 31st, August 30th, there was 13 crosses burnt on his lawn. His windows got slashed out, racist graffiti all over his house, and they tried to burn down his house in 30 days. The reason I often tell this story is not, and again, I'll cut it short. This is a much longer-winded story, but the reason I'll cut it a little bit short and just kind of emphasize the fact that it is not simply the individuals that tried to burn down his house. It's not simply the people who tried to spray paint his house. It's not simply the people who put crosses on his lawn that are the defining mechanisms of racism. Before he even moved into the house, the federal government and the state defined what was valuable or who could be valued within a particular neighborhood. Before he even moved into the house, the realtors decided that they were going to essentially try to create white flight within this neighborhood and up the pricing point so that when black people moved into the neighborhood, they had double the cost. Right? Before he moved into the neighborhood, segregation existed. Before he moved into the neighborhood, racism existed. Right? So these systems predate the acute action of violence. And so our job here is to exist outside of the kind of framework of simply those acute actions and understand and unpack the systems that we're in. See, as designers, as architects, we have this obligation to be somewhat forward-thinking. And in order to be forward-thinking, we have to understand the totality of the systems that we're involved within. Because for nearly every injustice in this world, there's an architecture, a plan, a design that has been built to sustain it. I'll kind of pass through some of these, but the maintenance of a lot of these systemically oppressive ideologies requires us to construct, requires whiteness or requires a system of white supremacy to devalue, to decenter, to demoralize cultures and communities that don't exist within that framework, yeah? Okay. And again, when we talk about, what happened? Okay, maybe I did that? One second, y'all. Let's try this again. There we go. So as we talk about this, we understand that our values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. So what we believe in the world, what we're trained, what we're taught, gets infused into the spaces that we build, yeah? So that's at the core of what it means to think about design justice. So if the root of all oppression is the loss of memory, this is a, Paula Gunn Allen mentioned this quote, which is, again, if the root of all oppression is the loss of memory, then the root of all liberation must be the relentless preservation and making of memory. So how do we create spaces that create moments that allow for memory to happen, that allow for markers to be developed, for memorials and museums to our humanity to be embraced? So if our cities, our towns, our neighborhoods and blocks incubate our culture, which allows us to hold those memories, then for communities of color, of culture in America, there's power in the places and spaces that use architecture and design as a tool that allows our voices to be heard and our stories to be valued. So I'm going to pass through to what we are, what this is. So Co-Locate is a protest firm. Honestly, we started in 2017 with the direct intention of just pissing people off, and then the firm would flame out and we would all go find jobs elsewhere. That was the intention. Turns out people really enjoy and want to do this type of work, and really we just needed the capacity to bring it to bear. So co-locate comes from this combination of two words, colloquial and locate. The use of informal, sophisticatedly informal language, in this particular instance a design language, and locate, or location, right? A sophisticatedly informal language of a place, yeah? I know y'all do this here, but like, somebody says, "What up, though?" What do y'all say? Say what? Yeah, what up, though, right? Like that's a very specific local thing, right? Okay, so in particular locations, there are not just our verbal kind of cues that define where we are from, but there are spatial cues that define where we're from. So co-locate is the sequence of words and phrases that are habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency than chance. So when we talk about as an architecture, we think about this as the sequence of people in place that are habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency than chance. That just really means what people are where, how often are they there, and how are those spaces enhancing, improving the lives that they are living, yeah? So, actually, you're gonna see me pass through some of these things. Just don't worry, there's like 300 slides in here, so I'm not gonna go through all of them. A lot of this work starts prior to where we consider the design justice movement starting, right? Design justice as a movement is relatively young. We are about 12 years kind of running. But the roots of design justice, starting with W.B. Du Bois, starting with Booker T. Washington, have a history that really talks about the intersection of social constructs and physical constructs and how we interrelate with those things. Whether we are talking about Booker T. Washington and the community Washington Rosenwald schools, these schools that were built in the face of Jim Crow, in the face of segregation, that says we are going to make a way through creating space. So they created over 5,400, or generally 5,400 schoolhouses across the South in the face of segregation in the South, right? This is an architecture that is a direct response to an injustice. When we're talking about W.B. Du Bois and we look at the Philadelphia Negro, this is a case study, social experiment that walked around and talked to 10,000 people in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia in the late 19th century. The purpose being to understand the relationship that people had to the place and space that they were existing within. These are origin moments for what design justice is, because it necessarily asks us to incorporate the voice and vision of people who are living within a particular condition, and then utilize those stories, those narratives, as a means to create safer, more just, more liberated spaces moving forward, even if it's only for a moment. The Rosenwald schools existed for about 35 years. Most of them, there are about 10% of them are left out of that 5,400, right? It's a massive degradation of a very important moment in kind of social justice history or design justice history. It's been wiped off the map for the most part, right? But it was a vision. It was a vision for what a future could look like if we were seeking justice in our work. A lot of you know about kind of infographics being developed. A lot of, some of that kind of nature of what we think about as infographics now, W.B. Du Bois did around this specific context of land and labor, land and communities. So, what are the kind of meta considerations of design justice? We often talk about power as a core understanding. We always have to understand what power and the relationships of power are to physical space because architecture is a conduit to power. It holds and it elongates or attenuates power for those who have it, yeah? So power is, again, The history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. This is a quote by Malcolm X, and he really is talking about the landless versus the landlord. It's an understanding that if we are in a system that uses its power to distribute us across the landscape in a segregated manner or tries to control us in very specific ways, we have to understand that power and challenge it if we want to ever live a more just, more liberated life. Our values, again, I mentioned our values, our collective values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. And so in racist systems, in oppressive systems, we create monuments to the hubris of those oppressive systems through the physical environment. Again, we attenuate the level of power that is put out into the world by creating an architecture that supports it. Care, right? So design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. This is a crib from Dr. Cornel West, who talks about love, or justice is what love looks like in public. If we think about what spatial design is, it is a deep expression of care for a beloved community expressed in its physical form. That also means that if you are going to design for a beloved community, you have to actually be in community. Designing a building as just an object that is for a community ignores the fact that people have constituent lives that wrap around these spaces on a day in, day out basis, right? So if you care, if you say that you care, then designing for that beloved community means that you are designing with that community, yeah? And then lastly, culture. What is culture? So culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. It is a collective coping mechanism that is anchored in power, values, and care, right? It understands that when we talk about a collective coping mechanism to the traumas that exist in our world, it allows us, a lot of people hear this and they think about it as as we're saying that all culture is negative. But really, culture is resilience. Culture is a way for communities to bond together, to create living conditions that are affirmative, that value our lives, that allow us to carry that energy with us into our day in, day out lives, even when the world around us is telling us that we are not worthwhile, yeah? And I mean that across the board, cultures more broadly. All right, so then design justice, what is that? So for nearly every injustice in this world, I said there is an architecture, design, a plan that has been built to sustain that injustice. So design justice asks us to forward a radical liberatory vision for racial, social, and cultural justice through the built environment. It's through the process and outcomes of design. It's not enough just to have a pretty building. It's not enough just to have a pretty building. It requires us to have a process that includes our communities, as we just mentioned. It also requires us, in all projects, to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression, right? When we talk about hostile architecture, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, when we talk about unfit housing in particular communities, all of these things are tools that are being used to control and push people in particular directions. And I know sometimes it's hard to make the deeper connections, but the intention here is to know that we are not the solution to every issue in this world, but we are a part, and we have shirked our responsibilities for oh so long. So you, as students in this, are going to inherit a profession that has always thought of itself as too small to affect the big issues of our world and too big to deal with the nuanced, small issues of our world. And so we found this nice little niche where we actually don't have to do anything, where we don't have to care about people, where we don't have to design a building that actually serves, right? So our job then is to break out of that conundrum that we find ourselves in, that architecture school sometimes teaches us to stay within and push past it. So part of that then is understanding what a system of power actually is. What does that mean? We often talk about the signals and the receivers. And this part of the presentation really is just a way for you to understand the foundation as you think about, I'll show you a little bit of the architecture here shortly, but as we talk about the signal and the receiver, we're talking about, again, those who control power through pedagogy, policy, and procedure. And then those who receive those signals, right? The practice, projects, programs, and people. So when I think about pedagogy, we're talking about the ideology that gets ingrained in us. The policies then are the codification of those ideologies. And then when we talk about procedures, it's how we implement. It's how we implement that code, right? That code that we have for ourselves. And so when a red light, when you drive up to a red light, you know what to do because it's a red light, right? You've been trained to say, okay, I know what that is. I'm going to do this thing that everyone else in the world has been taught to do. Yeah? That makes sense, okay? So that's what the codes are. They're basically just telling us how we can operate in this world, what we can build, when we can build it, who we should serve, when we should serve them, so on and so forth. And so on the other side of that, we are all receivers to those signals, and we might say, sure, I agree. A red light is a reasonable way for us to collectively agree not to run into each other. Fine. We might say, no, it's not. We all prefer a blue light, right? But that's up to us then to say, okay, well, let's challenge this system because this part of the system is not working for us. Right? And the same thing can be scaled up in infinitum. So understanding again that these are not just moments in time. There's a long critical history of design injustice. And so when we're dealing with issues like affordable housing, there is a backstory that actually defines how we can address things. So we might talk about a critical path looking at the Black Codes, 1865, post-Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation. We're talking about a series of codes that were established, previously called pig codes, slave codes. These are codes that were designed to constrict and confine where Black people could maneuver. A lot of our codes and laws were defined as a byproduct of constricting the other or the undesirable from being able to access resources, so on and so forth. So whether or not we're talking about the end of Reconstruction or Bauhaus or kind of Plessy versus Ferguson, which kind of established, re-established or considerably established racial segregation in public spaces, whether we're talking about the Federal Housing Authority and redlining, which I presume most of you have studied, looked at, understand at this particular point, or Euclid versus Ambler, which allowed for police force to be used relative to zoning. It's a zoning particular Supreme Court case, which established zoning as a rule of law. Whether it was Project Housing or the suburbanization outside of our city centers, happening at a dual moment in time where we started to constrict and consolidate where certain people could live, create housing stock that would consolidate their footprint, whatever their footprint might look like. And you've seen it. If you've done any study of Detroit, you know that this is a big thing that has happened here as well as, again, the suburbanization of things. We also saw highways cut through a lot of neighborhoods. I know that there was, that happened here as well. All the way to the act of slum clearance that happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We saw CEPTED developed in the 70s, which is a way to, essentially the National Police Force said, we would like to manipulate or to control communities a little bit better, and we want to use architecture to do that. And so here are the rules by which we can do that. So in 1978 or 1972, they started a national law enforcement kind of coalition that put together research studies that started to define what does it look like in schools if we were to do CEPTED? What does it look like in businesses and commercial corridors? What does it look like in neighborhoods? The first thing they found, 1968, when they did the first studies, the law enforcement officers wrote a report and it said, this does not work, but we should keep doing it anyway. So CEPTED is this thing that you'll hear that still exists in this world, and they will tell us that it works, but from the very beginning, they knew that it didn't work. And so what are the ways that we can actually, instead of thinking about crime prevention through environmental design, which immediately criminalizes, what does it look like for us to think about community power through environmental design? So these are kind of reframing and rewiring how we want to center our own work. And then lastly, when we look about a critical path of design justice in the 1980s, from 1981 to 1989, we saw a complete erasure of the HUD budget. About 80% of the HUD budget was wiped out, right? And so the tools that we had at our fingertips to be able to create less pain in this world, we started to eliminate, right? Okay, so how do we then challenge that? A lot of our work goes from, starts to move past the kind of standard practice of our standard scope of services for a design firm, which really starts after a developer or a client has done all of the community work that they needed to do, and they usually give us a template and says, here's what you need to know about this, go build a building for these folks. If you know any developers, if you know clients, which you don't yet, maybe you do, they're not very good at it either. So the intention here is that we have to move past the kind of simple outreach that is a communication style. It really is just, we're going to do this thing, here's what that looks like, right? We move past that, we move into engagement. Engagement allows us to have a communication feedback loop that really allows for community voice to be ingrained in the design decisions that we make. And so as you think about your studios, as you think about the designs that you're actually doing in class, think about the communities that you're designing for. Think about, can I just call somebody? Can I talk to somebody that is in this particular neighborhood or community that I am designing for? I know it's difficult sometimes to just cold call people, but it will improve your projects exponentially when you know the humans that you're designing for. And then lastly, organizing. So again, as I mentioned, co-locate was designed as a tool, as a act of protest. And when I say protest, I often talk about protest as an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society. It is fundamentally about our collective hope for what a just future, what a liberated future looks like. I don't see protests as, you often hear protest and riot kind of often set together. But protest is only about hope. If you've ever tried to organize a protest or anything of that sort, we start with a prayer, we start with caring for others, we start with how we are going to protect one another. That is how we start. And so in design, can we start from that same premise? Can we start with the same premise that this work that we're doing is built here to protect us, right? And so it is a tool then to organize, right? The best things to organize are the things that we build together, or organize around are the things that we build together. Building a building is huge. It takes a long time, and there's so many opportunities to build together, to build community, right? So that's a huge opportunity that we miss if we're not actually using these spaces that we're creating to cultivate and engender community, not just for the purpose, if you just want to think about it from a shrewd perspective, if you build a building that no one cares about, it will be abused, right? So if you build a building that people do care about, it'll last longer, it'll have a longer lifespan, people will care for it, it'll be used in a more consistent way. See, the benefits of connecting your projects back to community are not just simply that, they're not simply that you get a chance to build a building, but that building will have a longer lifespan than it previously would have. Right? I always get this question, there's often two buildings that will sit next to each other, and one will have graffiti all over it, the other one will just be clean. What do you presume that's about? This can be a conversation. Anybody? What do you think that's about? Why would one building have a bunch of graffiti on it and the other not? There you go.
Didn't hold value the same way the other building did.
Okay.
There wasn't a personal connection, so it didn't hurt them to affect it or change it in some way that either gave it a personal connection
Yeah.
or created it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a connection that people have to one building over the other. Oftentimes people think graffiti or murals just kind of show up. Those are humans that have either been hurt or harmed by systems in the same way. If there is a building that shows that it cares about the community, they often can get through some of those things. Yeah. So part of this work then says that there are a couple principles of practice. In our process, in our work, we lean into a couple, a process and design. The principles of process talk about the fact that we honor the griot, so we honor the people, those stories that are extant, bless you, that are centered in the community. That means that when I say honor the griot, it's the Miss Ellens, the Miss Marys on the block who have lived there for 60 years and know where the crack in the street happened in 1970, right? They understand a community so well. They have a PhD in the block. They understand the community. They understand generations of people who have lived in that particular place. Talk about land and liberation. So when we talk about land and liberation, we're understanding that land helps us feel secure, that allows us to move forward past a general day in, day out survival mode, right? So liberation is a byproduct of us being able to create spaces where people feel welcome, feel at home, and feel like they have ownership over a place. We build power in place. We build power in the communities that currently exist. The last thing on that one is just culture is evolution and culture is revolution. So culture is evolution, meaning obviously when I talk about culture is a trauma response, it's a coping mechanism to our built world, to our, when I say constructed world, not just our built world, but the social, physical world that's built around us. It takes a long time sometimes for us to kind of create a way of operating, a way of being in the world. But it also sometimes can change on a dime, right? Right, that might mean what happened after George Floyd was murdered, right? Where the world shifted. And right now you see this thing where it's struggling and trying to shift back, right? You see everyone saying, okay, well, we did that thing. You people should be happy. We're going to move on, right? And so what does it mean? There's always that constant fight. So culture is both an evolutionary kind of consideration and it's a revolutionary consideration. And then on the theory and design side, we commit to being radical in design. Does anybody know what radical means? You can just say no, it's fine. Okay, that's cool, it's rhetorical anyway. So radical just means, the etymology is radish, right? It means to get to the root. Oftentimes when we think of radical or we hear radical, we're talking about, we feel like it's the extremes, right? That's what you hear. Radical means one extreme or the other extreme. Radical means deep. I'm going deep to understand an issue before I try to solve for an issue, right? So I encourage you to be radical in your design, not to find an extreme, but to dig deep, to understand what the root of an issue is before you start to try to solve for that issue, yeah? And there are a million issues that you have to deal with in that's hyperbole, but you know, there's a lot of issues you have to deal with in designing a building. And so use each moment to dig deeper and deeper and deeper as you can. Imagine a just future. When we talk about an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just future, if you don't believe that there is a possibility of the world being a little bit better from the project that you're working on, why are you doing it? Is it just to get a paycheck? Some people do that. That's a thing. But if you want to do this work and you want to be of service to this larger movement, then understanding that we have to imagine what a just future looks like for the broadest amount of people that we can, that allows our architecture to strive for a little bit more than it did the day before. Doesn't mean we'll be perfect, doesn't mean we'll make it on every single building, but it means that we are striving in that direction. We must recognize that form follows fiction. I often say this, you've heard the term, obviously, people have heard the term form follows function. Specifically in marginalized communities and disinherited communities and communities that have been, have had their histories buried or washed away, our stories hold so much of, they hold our form, they hold how we interact with the world. Because our buildings don't often get a chance to last or survive. Because the spaces in land that we were supposed to have was either stripped away from us or the like, right? There are all of these things that have happened across the board that recognize and honor the fact that stories can help shape what space can be as well. And so if that's the case, then how many people can you talk to understand the veracity of that story, right? We talk to as many people as possible so that our story is clearer and that the fidelity of our architecture becomes clearer as a byproduct of that. And then lastly, design is protest. I mentioned what protest looks like. So design, if design can also tap into that unyielding faith, then I think we're on the right track. So I'll go through two more things, and then I'll just maybe show a little bit of the kind of architectural work as a byproduct of some of this work. We deal with not just the ist as in kind of racism, but all isms, right? And our work, just like our work can be intersectional, systems of oppression are also intersectional. They are also attempting to engage us in a multitude of ways. And so if we understand the difference between, as we get caught up in our system, the difference between an ist, an operator or an operant of a practice or a system, and the system itself. The isms are the system. Can someone name an ism that's not racism? Sexism, good. What else? Huh? Prism? Okay, prism. All right, prism is a system of light. Yeah, I'll take it. Polytheism, yes. Heidism. Environmentalism. Buddhism. All religionisms, yes. Okay, so what we hear is about a system. Did that system have a negative or a positive? Sexism. Bad? Good? Bad, yeah. What about Buddhism? Bad? Good? It's a religion, so it has its things, right? Okay. Okay, so systems can hold power and direct them in a bunch of different ways, right? But oftentimes the systems that we're talking about are the isms that are impacting us on a acute level, on a day in, day out level, that are preventing people from having the access to resource assets and a just kind of life. So whether that's height, whether it's sexism, whether it's racism, whether that's ableism, these are all things that we are attempting to mitigate in our work. And this is where culture comes in. When culture is a response, is a resilient response to those isms, it means that our architecture can lean into the variations that have been created by our various cultures to support and help us design buildings that are more attuned, more aligned, and create a better architecture for people. So culture in its best form allows us to recognize that these biases of power that will interact with our relative communities will create these pattern reactions, right? They'll create these reactions that then become what our culture is defined as. And so I'll jump into the last thing, and then we'll go into the architecture, is status quo to liberation. So a lot of this is grounding, but understanding that status quo to liberation means that we can exist in an unjust system, or we can exist in a system that has no change to its current outputs, its current harms, and we can kind of move towards a system that seeks liberation. On one end of the spectrum, we're talking about equality that really starts to make fair in the present and affirm a standard of fairness in the future, meaning equality doesn't actually ask us to do anything. It just says, can you make a pledge to be fair in the future? And you say, sure, I'll try. Right? That's what equality asks us to do. On the other end of that spectrum, liberation then says to repair for past injustices, to make fair in the present, remove barriers to progress, and to affirmatively influence the future outcomes of those who have been marginalized, to repair for past injustices. That even means when they are not our injustices. And sometimes it's hard for people, right? And so what liberation then asks us to recognize that, justice and liberation asks us to recognize that justice is a remedy within the context of an existing system. Liberation is a extrication from that system, but either way, we are carrying with us the traumas of the system that we've been a part of. And so if we are seeking justice in a particular project, it means that we are trying to mitigate the harms of some of these isms in these buildings, right? In these spaces, right? Meaning As a firm, we don't work on any firm or any project that has a jail in it or a place that imprisons people, right? It's a simple one, but that's a version of our work. It also means if we want to affirmatively influence people, then we might create restorative justice spaces, spaces that affirm our lives, that affirm our ability to move past some of those traumas. Okay, so here's what that sums up to. If we want to be anti-racist in this work, if we want to think about design justice or libertarian praxis, then we have to know that our work requires us to acknowledge and represent, to hold a narrative. It means that our work has to have some sort of mutual aid, and it has to have the ability to deconstruct and construct new narratives into future set. It's got to set a future that people want to live into. All right, so I'm going to show you a few small projects to large projects and leave some time for us to actually have a bit of a conversation. So this is a project that we worked on with an organizing collective called DAP, Designers Protest Collective. When we think about design, sometimes we get stuck on the fact that we have to have an architecture. Sometimes communities don't need that immediately. They need us to be in conversation on small scales and then work our way up to things. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you projects that work our way up to a larger set. This is a project called the People's Memorial. It's a buildable memorial that essentially allows us to engage with communities that have had a loss of life, often through police violence, to create a memorial quickly and to establish it in place in a mobile way. Part of this is a response to the post-Civil War. If anybody knows, a lot of the memorials that have been torn down over the course of the last 5-6 years, most of them are created in a Sears factory in Connecticut. They are generally all the same. They just changed the belt buckle from Union to Confederate, and they shipped them out across the country. That's why they crumple so easy. So you've probably seen some of them come down and they just kind of squish, right? They crumple so easily because they were made poorly, right? And that's because the monuments weren't there as a means to identify or create a moment for reflection on that particular individual who passed. They were there to signify that the Confederates were still in charge. So there were these monuments that kind of were put up across the country. They were put up quickly, and they were put up, again, pretty expansively. The intention for this project was to put up as many memorials in the same kind of extents. So we're going to try to put up over the course of the next few years nearly 2,000 monuments across the country. Again, this is in community with those who have been harmed through police violence or the like. I worked on a project called Lights Out. This was a project that was with community members in New Orleans to talk about our housing crisis. Post-Katrina, there were 50,000 houses that were underwater, theoretically and metaphorically and literally. As a part of that, by the time we hit 2015, we had about 30,000 houses. So we adjudicated about 20,000 houses, but then we still had a landscape of buildings that were not being put back into service. We wanted to understand why, because they were hurting and harming our communities, right? Because we had abandoned buildings. These spaces were places where sometimes fires happened, people were sleeping in those buildings, they were unsafe, so on and so forth. And so the intention was to understand, again, how do we reconcile that narrative and that story? Look at the things that had happened in New Orleans that were successful, that were not, whether it's Make It Right or Musicians Village, to diagram out the housing crisis itself, start to understand what that looked like, to develop a series of definitions and histories that helped us talk to community members and have teach-ins. As you see here, we worked with young students to develop a campaign where we ran for president and we ran for mayor. So it was a coalition of about 50 people who developed this particular program. We did second lines from house to house, from abandoned house to abandoned house. We held poetry and talked about the families that lived in these particular places. We developed an ad campaign, and again, we held teach-ins. We occupied a particular board for about 12 months and held a teach-in once a month while we were running for office. We weren't really running for office, but the theory was that we acted as such. About 2 years ago, so a couple of these are planning projects. We did a project called Paper Monuments. So Paper Monuments from 2017 to 2019. In New Orleans, we had a litany of, again, Confederate or racist monuments that existed across our city. We went through the process of attempting to remove those monuments. As a byproduct, we talked to 10,000 people across the city. We got about 1,500 proposals, and those proposals helped us kind of put context to a history of violence through spatial violence in our city. At one point, Robert E. Lee, who's being taken down in the back here of the center image, was one of the tallest buildings in the city. For 150 years, it was the tallest public monument in the South. And so it sat there looming over. Robert E. Lee never came to New Orleans, and if he did, he still would have owned 190 people, human beings, right? So to have him exalted as the kind of primary circle, the defining mechanism of navigation in our city and honor in our city was a bit of an issue. And so we asked people to think about imagining new monuments to New Orleans. We created opportunities and occupied space so that we could leverage the systems, whether it was our public libraries, whether it was our transit, arts and cultural spaces, to talk about a various set of stories that have been hidden or buried over time. Again, we worked in a lot of our libraries, we worked at a lot of our museums to talk to thousands of people, worked in our schools. We built makeshift or pop-up public spaces. We occupied the podiums of previous monuments and built new monuments to our people. We reflected those voices. So when we talk about a process and a set of outcomes, we created a series of public posters that were based on the culture of our city, the families, the legacies, the women who shape our city, and we put that back out into the world. We worked with over 50 artists and writers to create a series of contemporary posters that then got blown up to monumental size. I often talk about these three because they gave us the opportunity to take the next step, which meant that in the Desire projects in 1970, there were 200 officers and 4 tanks that came to essentially annihilate the Black Panther headquarters in New Orleans. And as doing so, the Black Panthers were ready. They had preparation. They got a lot of the kids out of the building. But that was an important moment in organizing history, in the city's history in general. One of the students that was at the building that day when they tried to bulldoze the headquarters became a docent or became a worker for the city. And while this was up, once we plastered it on the walls, we wheat pasted these all over the place, he sat outside next to this poster for 3 months and would tell the story of that day to anybody who got off the bus. So creating space doesn't always mean that we have to create architecture. It may lead to that, we get there, but our conversations, especially for people who have been, again, historically marginalized, take a little longer. Dorothy Mae Taylor, this poster that you see right here, Dorothy Mae Taylor helped to desegregate Mardi Gras, which is an amazing feat. Does anybody know when that happened? Think about, when was Mardi Gras desegregated? It's a guess, you're gonna be wrong, so just, it's fine, say something. Anybody? Say it again? 1984. It's a good guess. I want one more guess, and then I'm gonna be like, one more guess. Yeah, you. Early 2000s. Great, we'll meet in the middle, 1996. Yeah, it's crazy, right? Desegregating a institution that we all know, right? It's wild. And then lastly, I'm sorry, her kids saw this poster, sent it around to the family group chat and said, are we okay with this? They made this, and now they go and protest. They go and sit at City Hall and use this as a tool to re-engage back in kind of the public world. Lastly is the Claiborne project. So on the right-hand side, you see a project that over 60 plus years, and I'll talk about where we are on this project now, but over 60 plus years, a highway, 60 years ago, a highway cut through the oldest African-American neighborhood in New Orleans, in the Treme. In doing so, eliminated 400 live oak trees, 400 businesses, give or take, decreased the health, wealth, and educational attainment in that particular neighborhood. And the forces of community fought back to try to create something that was in response to this highway cutting through. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So these are some of those murals scaled up to 10 feet. We put them at transit stops. We did an unframed history or framed history exercise in which we took those same posters and put them in the locations where the actions actually happened. So whether that was the Robert Charles riots, which is one of the riots, infamous riots in New Orleans, to St. Catherine Drexel, who helped to navigate Xavier University into the university that it is today. And we let the environment, the world, kind of act and interact with some of these things. So when we talk about things being spray painted, this is what happens. Sometimes the world, whether it's rain, weather, our own imaginations, these stories, these histories get buried, they get covered up. And so it is our job oftentimes to kind of create spaces that tell those stories. This is an exercise that we did with some of our proposals that started to reflect and create versions of those imagined monuments. Okay. All right, so that's what those were. And then lastly, I'll talk about Claiborne. So Claiborne Innovation District, as I mentioned, in 1968, there was a response to a highway cutting through our oldest African-American neighborhood, and that response was to create an organizing effort called the Claiborne Avenue Design Team. So the Claiborne Avenue Design Team was a collection of thinkers, of social activists, of professors who got together to talk about what it meant to restitch a community that had been detached as a byproduct of the highway coming through. And so it meant that we had to have a long-running conversation. So from 1969 to 72, they produced this report that was, in fact, a collection of narratives, as I mentioned earlier. It was a way to think about the mutual aid of a place, the deconstruction of oppressive systems, the construction of new worlds, and then future setting. What can this world look like when we do something for a future that doesn't presently exist? So we had to talk to thousands of people. We did that through talking to environmentalists, people who are thinking about climate change. We talked to our elders in community. We did artist workshops, business workshops, tons of youth workshops. And we started to get to a series of design elements that really started to reconnect spaces underneath the highway that had been that have been used since the late 60s. So creating multiple levels, creating market booths and spaces that are used as a means to advance Black and brown businesses in the city. Part of this exercise was that we often got the question, why don't you put some of these businesses in some of the surrounding houses outside of the highway? Part of the answer to that is taxes increase the property value year over year, meaning that our business owners weren't going to be able to maintain those spaces over time, which means they were more likely to go out of business than to maintain that business. So if we want to actually do the right thing, right, even though we want to build an architecture in this moment, what we know is that 95% of the Black and brown businesses that exist within New Orleans are 1 to 3 people throughout the entirety of their existence, right? So they're not small businesses, they're beta businesses, which means they don't get loans, they don't get the same level of support, right? So that's important to know where people are before you just try to throw an architecture at them. And so building smaller spaces that allowed us to accommodate is where we are. This is a couple renderings of where we're headed over the course of the next few years. Maintaining the use of the highway for our kind of cultural interactions like second lines, like Mardi Gras. Making sure that young people had spaces for music and culture to still be lifted up. All of those things have started to be put behind a paywall, and to create moments for our elders to be honored. So those projects are one collection of a lot of things that are happening in this particular neighborhood. That particular project, we just raised $5 million over the next 2 years. Those projects will go in the ground. The last few things are just simply we're working with local organizations. This is the New Orleans Museum of African American History and Culture. This particular building is a pavilion that is part of the museum's collection of Afrofuturist work that will talk about both the history of neighborhoods, this history of the Tremaine neighborhood, and where it is going forward. So this is a project that will be done mid next year. This is a project with the Lafitte Greenway talking about environmental displacement. So it's a bridgeway that kind of walks over a bioswale that will also be mid-year. This is a museum space that we're working on downtown in New Orleans. We're a young firm, so now architecture is going in the ground as we speak. This is a project we're working on in New York, a environmental justice high school. So I think ultimately the fact that our work has been able to find traction is less a reflection of a field unprepared for where we're headed, and more a reflection that there are clients and communities that have been asking for this for decade after decade, year after year, and have been met with disdain, have been met with a practice that has not prepared our students, our interns, our professionals to be able to interact in this particular way. So my hope for you is that you take whatever you take from here and from your classes, and to think about how you can design as protest, how you can maintain that level of optimism and faith that the work that you put into the world will be of service to the communities you serve. So thank you for taking the time, and yeah, I'll stop us there.
We have some time for a few questions, if any of you have any for Bryan. If you do, raise your hand. I will bring the microphone to you so you don't have to yell.
Thank you for the presentation. That was very insightful. My question is, do you see a way for genuine community engagement and organization to be integrated in the current typical practice of design?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way that there are multiple ways to do this. We come from a lot of people in our firm come from an organizing background, so we have a way of practice that automatically brings folks in. I'll tell you what we do. We hire what we call community design advocates or community design organizers. These are, the way that we view this is that the profession has decreased its touch to community in a real way. It means that basically you're only considered an architect if you do these things, right? And everybody else is striving to get here. but we had a stratified profession at one point. And so our job then is to hire people who care about the built environment, who care about their communities and want to be involved, and they become a part of the design team. And so what we've done, we worked on a project in Dallas that is a restorative justice facility. That restorative justice facility is in a former prison that was closed 13 years ago and will be turned into something that is community centered. We hired 8 community design advocates. 4 of them were formerly incarcerated in that particular space, right? So the job then is to make sure that we are dealing with folks who are the primary impacted community, expand out to those who have a direct impact or direct connection to the impacted communities, and then lastly to operator users, people who help make the building run, right? Or who will occupy the building on a more consistent basis. So our job then is to make sure that that's in there. I will say the other thing is, when we talk about community being invested into a particular project, not only do we try to make sure that we understand the decision points throughout the course of a project and allow for community members to know which decisions they have influence over, which I think is really important. Some things community members just won't have influence over, and you just have to be honest about that. But we also maintain a feedback loop. So every project we design probably 2 to 3 newspapers or some sort of pamphlet that honors the kind of qualitative, the narrative-based stories of people. Because what you'll often hear if you work at a community organizing space or a design firm that does a lot of community engagement, what you'll hear from people when you talk to them, and I had a couple conversations about this yesterday, is people will feel like you're not talking to enough people. You're not talking to the right community. You're not talking to the right people. But what it means is that we are not corresponding. We're not giving enough feedback that says, here are all the people we have talked to, right? Because there isn't a trust level there, right? So our job then is to create a newspaper that is a feedback loop that allows people to see who we've talked to answer FAQs, and to respond as needed. We create an internal document called a spatial implications document, which takes every community voice nearly. So on a given project, we might have 50,000 comments from people. We'll siphon them out, we'll tag them, and we will send them to the client. And the client will say, okay, the client doesn't say anything to us. We just tell them what it is. And we'll say, here's what the community is saying. Here's the architecture that we're designing as a byproduct of those comments. And then lastly, we developed a new set of architectural documentation called Design Justice Working Set, which essentially takes every comment that I just talked to you about, those 50,000 comments, and we'll categorize those into themes, and then we tag every decision we make about the design of the building with those themes. And so the community voice is vested in the public feedback, it's vested in the internal decision-making of the client, and it's vested in the architectural documentation of a project. So that's how we invest community in it. Yeah.
Another question? Okay.
While designing for the highway project, I wondered why you didn't bridge over the highway. Have you considered doing that, or was it out of budget, or what were the boundaries regarding that?
Yeah, most of it is budget. I mean, I think in large part we're dealing with. Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Okay, so the highway. The area that would become the highway was owned by the city originally, or owned by the state. It was then leased. So it was owned by the city, leased to the state, and then leased back to the city. So the right to the land is very is conflicting, right? So first things first is, whenever you have to deal with multiple agencies or authority having jurisdictions, you will have a much harder time spanning across those things. So that's one thing. I would say the other thing is that the city did a massive study to come away with three separate options for what to do with the highway. One was to take it down entirely. The other was to dead the highway. So when I say dead the highway, stop the cars, remove some of the off-ramps on it. The other was to leave it up and then build underneath, right? Leaving it up, letting all the cars continue, and building underneath was the cheapest version. New Orleans, a lot of people know this, small city, not a lot of money, and so the option became, what can we do with the money we have? So that's where we landed is, let's build something underneath until they decide to take the thing down, and we'll try again then. So thanks for that question.
When you do, so a lot of the projects you showed us are like focused, like their purpose and intent is also focused around like social justice. Have you considered yet like how your firm's type of architecture where you're incorporating the community and things like that affects projects or could be used in projects that aren't focused around social justice? So maybe it's just like a building being built for a bank building or something, but it still might be important to incorporate those community aspects and things into the project.
Yeah. So I think first, we view every building as a project of social justice, doesn't matter what it is. Because it has a direct responsibility to its partners, to its neighbors, to its street, to its public, but also banking, if we were just to use that particular example, certain communities have been unbanked for a very long time. Their access to how banking might work is something that an architecture can challenge, right? That's a huge deal. So I think for us, because we're a nonprofit, we are also an advocacy organization. And so the work that we do, we use essentially to establish a precedent so that we can push advocacy into other RFPs, into other proposals, other procurement processes. And so when we work with an institution like Portland Community College, I'll give you for example, when I worked for the city of New Orleans, I used to write a lot of proposals and procurement for my department. And I would change the kind of outputs, whether that was around a community benefits agreement, whether that was hiring DBEs or community engagement, right? All of those things were necessary. We worked with an organization in Portland which took some of the RFPs that we did, and they had one project for $32 million three or 4 years ago. There are now $3.2 billion worth of work in the Pacific Northwest that are centered on design justice and critical race theory. Not because they're our projects, because they're not. Only 3 of them have been our projects, bless you. But the influence was beyond our project, and they're on projects that I don't know whether or not they're like hyper focuses on a justice outcome. But what I do know is that the procurement process requires it to consider a justice outcome, right? So that's I think part of what we like to do is to be advocates for it regardless of time and place. Yeah.
We're going to take our last question from the chat online.
So Doreen Hunter, who is the current executive director of ASID Detroit, asks, how can we get to the point where the community comes first and not necessarily the cost of the project?
Yeah. Good. It's a good question. I mean, so I think community, because here's the thing, community comes first in projects that have no money, right? Like when we do projects with community members, they often don't have any money. And so if we're able to do it in that particular instance, I think we can manifest that in larger projects. I think the big thing is when there isn't clarity about how to do it, people defer to what they know how to do. So creating systems that allow for a community process to have a considered outcome is necessary. We didn't start making design justice sets within our architectural sets because we just wanted to do it. We did it because it set precedent, it locked in community voice, it gave us a product that our clients and our developers would pay for, right? And that made it viable. So when I say I have a standard scope of services, we don't ever do a standard scope of services. We always do a scope plus, which allows us to say, and again, some of this is jargon, but when we ask for our community-based process, we lay out what that means, what the client is going to get as a byproduct of that, and it's more likely that they are willing to pay for it when they understand the tools, the assets, the kind of resources that come as a byproduct of that. So I think that's the big thing, is like we have to demonstrate the value, and then once we demonstrate that value, I'll be honest with you, like if you, as a small business owner, what I realized very early is that it is equal to like we don't get paid as architects. We don't really get paid all that much money. Sorry if y'all don't know that yet. You'll learn it. So you have to ask for what you want. And I will say that if we start to forward communities, there's a whole other pot of money oftentimes from if you wanted to think about this from a shrewd perspective, to be in support of communities. So I think, make the argument and create both procurement protocols and the response to those procurement protocols that allow us to kind of move the projects forward. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Bryan, thank you again for joining us today and sharing. And also thank you to everyone who joined us here in person and online. And lastly, speaking of power, exercise yours today. If you haven't done so, I know Matt has. Get out and vote. Thank you.
Yes, go vote.